I've been dreading on making this video for quite a while, but it has to be done. So it's almost been 2 weeks since the release of Star Wars The Last Jedi, and so far, without a shadow of a doubt, The Last Jedi is the most divisive amongst all of the Star Wars films that have been released. And despite all of the controversy that this film has caused, it's still doing pretty well at the box office. And when it comes down to The Last Jedi, you either love the film or you downright despise it. And me personally, I absolutely love The Last Jedi. Now, as I previously have mentioned in my review for the film, I am not a die-hard Star Wars fan. I don't know too much about the expanded lore or even some of the Legends canon, and I only really focus on the movies. But if you are a die-hard Star Wars fan, then chances are your views on the film might be completely different to mine, or maybe you might even agree with me on some things. So what I want to do in this video is to look at all of the negative points revolving around The Last Jedi, and kinda analyse as to why so many people are against the choices that this film has made. And again, I'm only going to be focusing on the main points that many people have complained about. And yes, this video will have a ton of spoilers, so if you haven't seen this film already, don't even watch this video. So the first one I want to focus on is quite possibly the biggest complaint of them all, which is in fact the portrayal of Luke Skywalker. As many people believe that both Disney and Rian Johnson have completely bastardized this character. Mostly because this version of Luke is unlike anything that has been seen before. As this Luke Skywalker is completely broken and is almost hopeless at this point. And honestly, this was exactly what I was expecting out of this new version of Luke Skywalker. Now clearly, after the events of Return of the Jedi, Luke Skywalker has witnessed a lot of shit. And to me, the whole idea of him going into hiding and wanting the Jedi to end is completely justifiable. Especially since this takes place roughly 30 years after the events of Return of the Jedi. And if Luke was acting like this, if this film took place 5 years after the events of Return of the Jedi, then yeah, I would agree that this is completely out of character for Luke. But given how this film takes place 3 decades after that film, it does make sense for Luke to be a little different. And in my eyes, this version of Luke Skywalker is very well developed, and feels like a complete breath of fresh air to me. And as for the whole idea of Luke Skywalker trying to kill his own nephew Ben Solo, again, it does kinda make sense. And again, it is completely justified, as Luke could send Snoke within Ben Solo. And although Luke was considering on the idea of killing his very own nephew in order to save the galaxy, in the end he didn't go through with it. And it's not like Luke Skywalker isn't a killer, because in Return of the Jedi, Luke Skywalker was so close in killing his very own father. And again, I don't see how this is a major issue revolving around Luke's character. And before anyone points out over the fact that Mark Hamill himself doesn't like this portrayal of Luke Skywalker, of course he would feel that way. Because over the years, Mark Hamill himself has thought of his very own story revolving around Luke Skywalker and where he would end up being. And as you can see, Mark's vision isn't exactly the same as what we ended up getting in The Last Jedi. He doesn't like this portrayal because this isn't the Luke Skywalker that he was hoping to become. Not because that this is a shit portrayal. Now the next thing I want to talk about is of course in relation to General Leia and how she was capable of using her force powers in order to save her own life. Now the main reason people don't like it is the fact that they found it to be too confusing. And admittedly, it did look a little goofy. Now it has been previously established in that Leia does have the Force within her. And it does make sense for Leia to have the Force because she is the twin sister of Luke. Was it a little poorly executed? Yes. Did it still make sense regardless? Of course it did. Now the next thing I want to talk about is in relation to Rey's parents. Now before this film came out, the speculations revolving around Rey's parents was by far the hottest topic revolving around Star Wars. And there were so many different theories in that Rey could have been a Skywalker, a Kenobi, or even a Palpatine. But in the end, none of these theories were true. But in the end, Rey was some form of a Force baby, similarly to that of Anakin Skywalker. Now personally, I absolutely love the idea of Rey not being related to anyone, because making her into a Force child just gives her more of an identity of her own. And if she was to be related to a Skywalker, a Kenobi, a Palpatine or whatever else, then to me that would make Rey less special. Now another major criticism about The Last Jedi was in relation to Snoke, or more specifically the lack of information that we got out of this character and the fact that he was killed off near the halfway point. And when it comes down to Snoke, I'm in two minds points about this. On one hand, I can absolutely understand the criticism that this plot twist got, because in the last film Snoke was built up as the big bad of the series, and plus he was hinted at to be even more powerful than even Palpatine himself, and there was so much mystery surrounding this villain, and for this film to kill off this character does feel like a bit of a kick in the balls. But on the other hand, I do feel like it was a completely ballsy move to have Snoke killed off in the second film, because it perfectly sets up Kylo Ren's new path, and that he wants everything in the past to just burn in hell. And plus the whole idea of the apprentice killing the master is always a tradition, which is in the name of the rule of two Sith. And many people believe that Snoke is still alive somewhere and will take a new body for episode 9, to which in my mind is completely plausible. And speaking of Kylo Ren, people do take issue revolving around his objectives, because he already established that he wants to kill all of the Jedi, the Sith, the First Order and the Resistance. But right after he fails to recruit Rey, Kylo becomes the supreme leader in the First Order and proceeds in trying to track down Luke Skywalker, to which does in a way contradict what he was planning on all along. But the way I see things, Kylo Ren is so hell-bent on killing Luke Skywalker as well as tracking down Rey for betraying him, I feel like Kylo Ren just wants to do this by any means necessary, and that he's only really using the First Order as a means to an end. And after killing Luke Skywalker and Rey, I would imagine that Kylo Ren would probably destroy the First Order from the inside, or maybe even convert them into a new order. But either way, I feel like that this is easily explained. And as for the whole subplot between Rey and Rose, I can't defend that one. And there's no two ways about it, this is by far the worst part of The Last Jedi. It felt forced, it completely dragged, and both of these characters deserved better when it comes down to their own subplot. And then to follow up on that point, we do have the second death of Captain Phasma. But again, I'm in two minds about this whole thing. Because on one hand, Captain Phasma has always been a side character, so having her killed off again doesn't really bother me all too much. But on the other hand, I completely understand as to why people are so pissed off by this, because 2 movies in a row, Captain Phasma has been completely underutilized. And not only do we have a well-known actress known as Gwendoline Christie, but there was also a huge promise in that Captain Phasma would have a bigger role within The Last Jedi, when in reality she was just as useless here as she was in the last film. And although it didn't bother me personally, I do understand the criticism. And while some people believe that she will be back, I highly doubt it. And lastly, we have the surprise cameo coming from Yoda the puppet. Now the criticism doesn't come from the scene itself, but rather how Yoda looks in the film, as some people thought that he looked a little weird. Now initially I thought that too when I first saw Yoda, but the more I was watching the scene, the less I thought about it, because to me it was only the glow around Yoda that made him look a little weird. And honestly, Puppet Yoda looked just as good back then as he does now, and it was a pleasant surprise to see him back. But at the end of the day, the reason why The Last Jedi is so divisive amongst fans is the fact that they were expecting too much out of this film. And that is to be expected for sure, but more importantly, I don't think the fans were really ready for what was about to come. The perfect example being Rey's parents, as many fans was hoping for one of the theories to turn out true, but in hindsight it was none of the above. And to which the same could be said about Snoke. Many fans were expecting the film to go one way, when in reality the film went in a completely different direction. And although many fans do appreciate the ballsy direction coming from The Last Jedi, the other side of the spectrum were completely against it, as they were expecting their own theories to be true. And the hatred even goes as far as to have The Last Jedi to be considered non-canon, which to me is absolute overkill. And maybe if I was a die-hard Star Wars fan myself, then perhaps maybe I would be more picky about The Last Jedi, but in reality, I'm only a casual fan. And as I said earlier, I absolutely love the film. But in the end, every fan will have a completely different perspective revolving around The Last Jedi, and to each their own. So how do you personally feel about Star Wars The Last Jedi? Do you love this film? Do you hate it? Or are you somewhere in the middle? Comment below and share some thoughts. And as always, thank you guys for watching this video. Please like and subscribe. Take care and have a good one.